The rain in Normandy did not fall, it materialized. It was a heavy, grey curtain that turned the churned earth of September 1944 into a freezing, knee-deep soup of mud, diesel, and dried blood. In the center of a shattered clearing, surrounded by the splintered remains of an ancient oak grove, stood a machine that looked like a locomotive engine severed from its train. It was a Feldkirchen 11, the standard-issue military field kitchen of the German Reich. 1,200 kilograms of cast iron, double-walled copper, and reinforced steel. The soldiers affectionately called it the goulash cannon. Right now, it was the most important object in the world. Standing directly in front of the iron behemoth was Dietrich Kessler. He was 42 years old, a master baker from Frankfurt whose hands were thickly scarred not from shrapnel or barbed wire, but from decades of reaching into blistering stone ovens. He wore the field grey uniform of the Wehrmacht, but it hung loosely on his frame. His boots were sunk deep into the mud. His breath plumed in the freezing air. 3 feet away, the steel barrel of a Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle was pointed directly at the center of Dietrich's chest. The man holding the rifle was Sergeant Silas Vane. Vane was 48, a veteran of the trenches of the First World War. His eyes were the color of cracked winter ice, hardened by years of viewing the world through a sniper's scope and a veil of unrelenting grief. Vane did not see a baker. He did not see a tired, middle-aged man. He saw the enemy. Vane's finger rested inside the trigger guard. The safety was off. "Open the lid," Vane commanded. His voice was low, raspy, carrying the unquestionable authority of a man who had ended lives before breakfast. Dietrich stared at the rifle, then up at Vane's face. He understood the English words perfectly. He had served British tourists in his bakery long before the world caught fire. But he did not move immediately. Beside him, his 19-year-old apprentice, Gunter, let out a soft, involuntary whimper. Gunter's hands were clamped over his ears, his helmet missing, his face smeared with soot and terror. On Dietrich's other side stood Arndt Wolfram, 35, a former hotelier from Hamburg. Arndt stood perfectly rigid, his eyes darting mathematically, calculating the odds of their execution. "I said, open the bloody lid," Vane repeated, stepping half a pace forward. The bayonet attached to the rifle gleamed dully in the overcast light. Dietrich slowly raised his hands, palms open, showing the dusting of grey ash and flour worked deep into his cuticles. He needed to speak carefully. He needed them to understand that the hesitation was not defiance, but physics. "The pressure," Dietrich said, his voice thick with a heavy accent, but remarkably steady. He gestured slowly toward the massive 200-liter kettle at the core of the machine. "It is a pressure cooker. If I open the clamps now, without releasing the steam valve, it will explode. It will burn everyone." Vane's eyes narrowed. He pressed the rifle barrel against Dietrich's sternum. "Do it. Or you will not have to worry about the burns. Stand down, Sergeant." The voice cut through the rain and the tension like a physical blade. Major Alistair Thorne stepped into the clearing. Thorne was 32, the logistics officer for the 50th Northumbrian Division. He looked like a man who had been slowly walking toward his own funeral for a month. His uniform was soaked through, plastered to a frame that was visibly deteriorating. Beneath the wet wool, Thorne's body was consuming itself. Thorne was a man of numbers, and the numbers were currently spelling the doom of his men. The human machine requires fuel. Standard British military regulations dictated a daily intake of 3,300 calories to maintain combat effectiveness in the field. For the past 72 hours, the supply lines had been utterly severed. The famed Red Ball Express, the massive convoy system meant to keep the Allied advance moving, was bogged down in the relentless autumn mud miles behind the front. Thorne's men were surviving on less than 900 calories a day. He had watched his soldiers' body mass index drop precipitously, many nearing a critical, life-threatening level. He saw men who had stormed the beaches in June now struggling to lift their 30-pound ammunition boxes. He saw the hollows of their cheeks, the dark, bruised skin under their eyes, the way their hands trembled when they tried to light a match. It was a medical crisis unfolding in slow motion. Starvation does not scream, it whispers. It slowly shuts down the extremities to protect the vital organs. It makes men lethargic, prone to fatal mistakes, and ultimately, unable to pull a trigger. Thorne walked past Vane, gently pushing the barrel of the Lee Enfield downward. He stood directly in front of Dietrich. Thorne was a head taller, aristocratic in his bearing, but his eyes were completely hollowed out by exhaustion. "Show me," Thorne said. Dietrich nodded once. He turned to the massive iron stove. He did not move like a prisoner of war, he moved like an engineer approaching a precision instrument. He reached up to a solid brass valve near the top of the heavy iron lid. He turned it exactly a quarter of an inch. A sharp, deafening hiss erupted into the clearing. A thick plume of white steam shot straight up into the gray sky. And then, the smell hit them. It was not the smell of cordite, or wet wool, or the metallic tang of blood that had coated their nostrils for weeks. It was the smell of roasted barley, rendered pork fat, potatoes, and root vegetables simmering in a rich, thick broth. It was the smell of Sunday dinners before the world went mad. Around the perimeter of the clearing, dozens of British soldiers had gathered. They were shadows in the tree line, rifles slung low, drawn not by the capture of the enemy, but by the undeniable gravitational pull of that scent. Thorne heard the collective intake of breath from his men. He heard the unmistakable, involuntary sound of dry swallows from parched, starving throats. Dietrich waited for the pressure gauge to drop. When the needle hit 0, he unfastened the 4 heavy steel clamps that held the lid in place. He grabbed a thick canvas rag, wrapped it around the iron handle, and hauled the massive lid backward. A wave of heat washed over Thorne. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The physical shock of the smell was almost too much to bear. It triggered a deep, primitive response in his brain, a desperate, clawing hunger that bypassed all his officer training. Dietrich reached into a metal rack attached to the side of the wagon and pulled out a long, heavy steel ladle. He dipped it deep into the dark, bubbling mixture, stirring it from the bottom to ensure the meat and starches were perfectly distributed. He lifted the ladle. It was filled with a thick, heavy stew. He held it out toward Thorne. "Poison," Vane spat, stepping forward again, his hand hovering near his sidearm. "Do not touch it, sir. It is a jerry trick. They leave the kitchen behind, spike the food, and wait for us to drop." Thorne looked at the ladle. He looked at the stew. He could see the chunks of potato holding their shape perfectly, the barley swollen and rich with broth. He looked at Dietrich. The propaganda on both sides had been relentless. The German High Command had told its soldiers that the British were barbarians who executed prisoners on sight. The British had been told that every German was a fanatical monster capable of any deceit. But Thorne was a man of logic. He looked at the meticulous cleanliness of the German's apron, despite the mud of the battlefield. He looked at the way Dietrich held the ladle, not with fear, but with the quiet, unyielding pride of a craftsman. A man who intends to poison a meal does not stir it with such reverence. He does not care if the potatoes are cooked perfectly. Thorne reached out and took the heavy steel ladle from Dietrich's hand. The metal was burning hot, but he did not care. He lifted it to his mouth. "Major," Vane barked, horrified. Thorne took a mouthful. The heat burned his tongue, but the taste was an absolute revelation. It was densely caloric. The fat coated his throat, instantly soothing the raw ache of the cold. The carbohydrates from the potatoes and barley hit his stomach like a heavy, warm stone, sending an immediate, desperate signal to his brain that survival was possible. It was, without question, the most magnificent thing he had ever tasted. He swallowed, closing his eyes, letting the physical sensation of nourishment travel through his starved nervous system. He opened his eyes. He looked at Dietrich. The baker was watching him intently, searching Thorne's face not for mercy, but for a professional critique. "How many calories per portion?" Thorne asked, his voice rough. Dietrich blinked, surprised by the clinical nature of the question. He quickly did the mental math. Currently, approximately 2,600, Major, Dietrich replied, his English formal and precise. If I have the full fat rations. Today, perhaps 2,400. But it is dense. It sustains. Thorn lowered the ladle. He looked out at the perimeter. He saw his men. He saw boys who were literally wasting away inside their uniforms. He looked at Vane, whose hands were trembling slightly, not from rage, but from the same deep, cellular hunger that plagued them all. Standard operating procedure was absolutely clear. The Geneva Convention and British Army field manuals dictated that captured enemy personnel must be immediately disarmed, processed, and transported to designated prisoner of war enclosures in the rear echelon. But the rear echelon was 30 miles away through impassable mud. If Thorn sent these men back, his soldiers would have to escort them. More calories burned. More men exhausted. And the massive iron kitchen would sit here, cold and useless, because no British cook knew how to operate the complex pressure valves and fuel-efficient fireboxes of the German machinery. Thorn turned back to Dietrich. He looked at the master baker, then at the hotelier Arndt, and finally at the terrified apprentice Gunter. 3 men. 1 machine. 300 starving British soldiers. Sergeant Vane, Thorn said, not taking his eyes off Dietrich. Sir. Have the men form a line. Mess tins out. Vane froze. Sir. With respect, we are supposed to process these prisoners. Transport them to Sector Command. We do not have the authority to do this. I do not give a damn about Sector Command right now, Silas, Thorn said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. Look at your men. Look at Private Miller over there. He cannot even hold his rifle straight. We are a combat division that cannot walk, let alone fight. If we do not put fuel in their engines today, we will have casualties by morning from exposure and malnutrition alone. But employing the enemy. They are not the enemy right now, Thorn interrupted, his eyes locked with Dietrich's. They are cooks. And we are hungry. Thorn pointed at the massive iron kettle. There is enough food in there to keep this company alive. We are not wasting it. Vane's jaw tightened so hard it looked like the bone might snap. He hated the Germans with a purity that bordered on religious. But he loved his men more. He turned on his heel. Form up. Mess tins ready. Single file, move it. The response was instantaneous. The sheer exhaustion vanished from the British soldiers, replaced by a desperate, frantic energy. They scrambled out of the tree line, metal tins clattering, pushing and shoving to form a queue in the freezing rain. Thorn handed the heavy ladle back to Dietrich. You work for me now, Thorn said. It was not a request. It was a lifeline thrown across a chasm of hatred. Dietrich took the ladle. The steel was still warm from the soup. He looked at the long line of British soldiers forming in front of his kitchen. These were the men who had been shelling his position for 3 days. According to the political officers in Berlin, they were monsters who would slit his throat the moment he was no longer useful. But as Dietrich looked at the first soldier in the line, a boy no older than Gunter, his uniform hanging off his shoulders, his hands shaking violently as he held out his tin, the political propaganda evaporated. Dietrich did not see a monster. He saw a boy who was freezing to death. He saw a stomach that needed filling. In the bakery in Frankfurt, Dietrich lived by a simple, unshakable code. Flour, water, yeast, and fire were sacred. Food was not a weapon. Food was the fundamental right of anything that drew breath. Dietrich straightened his spine. He rolled up the sleeves of his gray tunic, exposing his thick, scarred forearms. He turned to Arndt and Gunter. His voice, previously quiet and cautious, suddenly cracked like a whip in the cold air, carrying the absolute authority of a master chef in his kitchen. Arndt, get the bowls. Control the portions. 400 milliliters per man, not a drop more, we must make it last. Gunter, check the firebox. Keep the temperature even. If this soup burns at the bottom, I will throw you in the kettle myself. Arndt immediately snapped to attention, the professional hotelier taking over. Gunter grabbed a heavy iron poker and scrambled to the rear of the carriage to tend the wood fire. Dietrich stepped up to the massive cauldron. The first British soldier stepped forward, his eyes wide, his chin trembling. Dietrich looked the boy in the eye. With a smooth, practiced motion, he dipped the heavy ladle into the stew, brought it up perfectly leveled, and poured the rich, steaming mixture into the tin. Eat, Dietrich said simply. The boy did not wait. He did not use a spoon. He lifted the hot tin directly to his face and drank the stew like water, groaning as the heat hit his stomach. Thorn stood to the side, watching the operation unfold. He watched his men, one by one, step up to the iron machine. He watched their faces change as the calories hit their systems. The shivering stopped. The hollow eyes gained a fraction of light. He watched Dietrich. The German baker moved with a hypnotic, mechanical rhythm. Dip, lift, pour. Dip, lift, pour. He was a machine of sustenance, operating with a furious, dedicated efficiency that no British catering corps could match. He wasted nothing. He spilled nothing. As the afternoon bled into a dark, freezing evening, the rain turned to sleet. But around the Feldkirche 11, there was a radius of intense heat. The firebox glowed orange in the gloom. Dietrich did not stop. His arms burned with lactic acid, his boots were filled with freezing water, but he felt a strange, profound sense of peace. He was no longer a soldier in a losing army. He was a baker feeding the hungry. The uniform did not matter. The fundamental mathematics of life, calories against the cold, was the only truth left in the world. When the kettle was finally empty, scraped clean by Arndt with a heavy wooden spatula, the British camp was silent. It was not the silence of fear, but the heavy, satisfied silence of men who were finally warm. Thorn walked up to the kitchen. Dietrich was wiping down the copper rim of the kettle with a rag, his movements precise and careful. We move out at dawn, Thorn said, looking at the map coordinates in his mind. The supply lines are still cut. We have 3 days of hard marching ahead to reach the rendezvous point in Holland. Can you keep my men fed on the move? Dietrich calculated the remaining rations stored in the compartments of the wagon. Flour, some preserved meat, dried vegetables. It would require extreme rationing, stretching the ingredients with water and whatever they could forage. It was technically impossible. Dietrich looked at Thorn. He saw the trust forming, fragile and desperate, in the officer's eyes. Yes, Dietrich said. We can cook. Thorn nodded once, turned, and walked into the dark. Dietrich leaned against the warm iron of the goulash cannon. He looked at Arndt and Gunter. They were prisoners. They were in the hands of the enemy. But as Dietrich listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of 300 sleeping British soldiers around them, he realized something profound. They were not captives. They had become indispensable. And in the brutal logistics of war, being indispensable was the only true armor a man could wear. The march toward the Dutch border was not a military maneuver. It was a slow, agonizing exercise in collective atrophy. According to the quartermaster's logs of the 50th Northumbrian Division, the first week of October 1944 brought record-breaking rainfall to the region. The autumn mud did not just cling to the soldiers' boots, it actively tried to pull them under. Through this gray, featureless purgatory, the British infantrymen pushed a machine of their enemies' making. Moving the Feldkirche 11 through knee-deep sludge required brutal, mechanical synergy. The British supply trucks had been abandoned 30 miles back, their axles snapped or fuel tanks utterly dry. It fell to human muscle. British soldiers leaned their shoulders against the freezing iron chassis alongside the German prisoners. They pushed in grueling, silent shifts. They conserved every breath, every erratic heartbeat, for the singular task of keeping the massive stove moving. Sergeant Silas Vane walked parallel to the iron beast, his rifle permanently slung across his chest. Vane was a man built entirely on the architecture of suspicion. He had watched Dietrich Kessler feed his men, but Vane did not believe in miracles, and he certainly did not believe in the sudden benevolence of a gray uniform. To the veteran sniper, the kitchen was a Trojan horse. He was simply waiting for the trap to spring. 72 hours, Vane muttered to Major Thorne during a brief, agonizing halt. Thorne was reviewing a sodden topographical map, his bare hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. That is how long before they try something. A diversion. A signal flare to their lines. You do not hand over your equipment and play housemaid to the enemy without a tactical angle, sir. Thorne did not look up from the map. My angle, Sergeant, is basic physiology. I have 300 men who have burned through the calories Kessler fed them 2 days ago. We are currently operating on an estimated 900 calories a day per man. Standard combat requirement is 3,300. If you look at the men, you will see a 15% drop in body mass index across the platoon. The human heart requires energy to pump blood. Without it, these men will drop dead in their tracks without a single German shot being fired. If Kessler is a trap, he is currently the only trap keeping our blood moving. Thorne folded the map and walked toward the mud-splattered kitchen. Dietrich Kessler was already at work. The master baker from Frankfurt did not wait for military orders. He operated on a rhythm dictated entirely by fireboxes, pressure gauges, and the brutal mathematics of starvation. What do we have, Kessler? Thorne asked, his voice hollow. Dietrich wiped his soot-stained hands on a heavy canvas rag. He pointed to the meager pile of supplies Arndt had scavenged from a ruined root cellar earlier that morning. A burlap sack of rock-hard, frost-bitten potatoes and a few dozen woody turnips. In a standard British open-trench kitchen, Major, boiling these root vegetables would take 2 hours, Dietrich stated, his English clipped and clinical. The wood is wet. The ambient temperature is near freezing. An open pot loses thermal energy faster than the fire can generate it. Vane scoffed, stepping closer. So we freeze while your water warms up. Brilliant German efficiency. Dietrich did not look at the sergeant. He patted the heavy double-walled copper kettle encased in the iron frame. This is not an open pot, Sergeant. This is applied thermodynamics. Dietrich barked a command in rapid German. Gunter scrambled underneath the carriage, opening the damp lower drafts, feeding small, carefully split splinters of dry wood they had protected under their own tunics. Arndt began violently scrubbing the dirt from the potatoes with a wire brush. He did not peel them. In a starvation scenario, peeling meant losing precious fractions of an ounce of carbohydrate. You ate the skin, the dirt, and the roots. Dietrich dumped the chopped, hard vegetables into the massive kettle. He added a precise measure of water, just enough to create steam, not a drop more. He swung the heavy iron lid shut, locking down the 4 industrial steel clamps. He adjusted the brass pressure valve at the top. Maximum airflow, Dietrich commanded. The fire roared inside the iron belly. The British soldiers, shivering in the driving rain, watched in exhausted silence. Within 10 minutes, the brass valve began to hiss. The pressure inside the kettle was building rapidly, trapping the heat, driving the boiling point of the water far beyond normal atmospheric limits. 15 pounds per square inch, Dietrich said quietly, tapping the glass face of the gauge. He pulled a silver pocket watch from his tunic. 30 minutes. The cellulose fibers will break down completely. They will be soft enough to mash with a wooden spoon. Thorne watched the needle hold steady. It was a masterclass in thermal efficiency. Exactly 30 minutes later, Dietrich released the valve. A massive geyser of steam shot into the freezing air. He unclamped the lid. The rock-hard, frozen potatoes and turnips had been reduced to a thick, steaming, starchy mash. It was a small victory. It provided immediate core warmth. But as the men lined up with their mess tins, Thorn knew the logistics were still completely against them. Mashed turnips and water offered perhaps 300 calories. It was not enough to sustain a fighting force. The men ate, their faces blank, the temporary warmth doing little to stop the deep, skeletal shivering. By midnight, the camp was dead silent, save for the wind. The rain had turned to a vicious sleet. Thorn sat under a leaking canvas tarp, his flashlight dimming, calculating the horrifying reality. They were out of food. The next day's march would kill the weakest men. A shadow moved at the edge of the tarp. Thorn unholstered his revolver in a fraction of a second, his thumb resting heavily on the hammer. Major. It was Dietrich. The baker stood in the sleet, his gray uniform practically invisible in the dark. He held his hands away from his body, palms open. "Speak," Thorn said, his voice a low rasp. Dietrich stepped out of the sleet and under the edge of the canvas. "You are calculating the end of your supplies. That is a military matter, Kessler. Return to the kitchen." "It is a mathematical matter," Dietrich corrected gently. "And the mathematics dictate your men will not survive the crossing tomorrow. Their bodies are consuming their own muscle tissue. They need dense lipids. Fat. I am aware of basic biology," Thorn snapped, exhaustion fraying his composure. "Unless you can bake bread from mud, the observation is useless." Dietrich was silent for a long moment. He was a prisoner of war. Under the chaotic rules of this broken front line, he owed these men absolutely nothing. If the British unit collapsed from starvation, the German lines were only miles away. He could wait. He could let them die, reclaim his kitchen, and walk back to his own army. But Dietrich Kessler remembered the hollow eyes of the boys waiting in the food line. He remembered the sacred oath of his trade. He reached deep into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, forged iron key. Underneath the primary ash box of the Feldkotcherd, Dietrich said quietly, "There is a secondary steel plate. It is bolted shut. It is designed to look like structural reinforcement. It is a smuggler's compartment." Thorn slowly lowered the revolver. "What is in it?" 12 kilograms of clarified butter. And 20 kilograms of heavily salted, cured pork fat. It was my emergency reserve. For my men. If we were cut off. Dietrich placed the iron key on Thorn's map table. 32 kilograms of pure, unadulterated fat. It is enough to fortify the vegetable mash for 3 days. It will give your men the caloric density they need to keep walking. Thorn stared at the key. The sheer logistical value of what Kessler was offering was astronomical. In the black markets of occupied Europe, 32 kilograms of pure fat could buy a man's life 10 times over. Dietrich had hidden it perfectly. The British search teams had missed it entirely. "Why?" Thorn asked, his voice stripped of all military pretense. "You are a soldier of the Reich." Dietrich looked at his scarred hands. "I was a baker long before the Reich existed, Major. And I will be a baker long after it falls. I do not hoard food while men freeze to death around me. Use the key. Feed your men." Dietrich turned and walked back out into the sleet. Thorn sat alone in the dark, the heavy iron key resting on the topographical map, feeling the profound, uncomfortable weight of a debt owed to the enemy. The next morning, the mood in the camp shifted dramatically. When the men tasted the rich, heavy fat melted into their morning rations, a surge of energy rippled through the division. The fat coated their stomachs, providing a slow-burning furnace of energy. They marched with renewed vigor. But the temporary reprieve only masked the deeper nightmare. As they pushed further into contested territory, the lack of vitamins began to show. Gums bled. Old wounds reopened. It would take exactly 48 hours for the fragile truce to completely shatter. They had taken shelter in the ruins of a bombed-out French farming estate. The Feldkotcherd was working at maximum capacity, rendering the last of the salted pork. But the men were desperate for anything fresh to combat the scurvy. Sergeant Vane had taken a foraging party into the overgrown, abandoned orchards behind the estate. They returned triumphant, carrying sacks of wild, hard crabapples and fiercely unripe, green tomatoes left to rot on the vines. It was highly acidic, brutal on the stomach, but it was fresh produce. "Boil it down," Vane ordered, dumping the sacks near the kitchen. "Make a jam. A stew. Something to cut the grease of that pork fat." Dietrich inspected the hard, green fruit. He shook his head. "The main iron kettle is currently rendering the meat, Sergeant. It is sealed under pressure. It will not be free for 2 hours. Then use something else," Vane snapped, pointing to a dented, massive copper boiling pot his men had scavenged from the ruins of the estate's washhouse. It was an old, industrial laundry boiler, large enough to hold 30 liters. "Set it over the open fire grate at the back of the wagon. Boil the fruit in that." Dietrich looked at the heavy copper pot. He ran his calloused thumb along the inside of the rim. The metal was dull, slightly green in places, heavily scratched. "No," Dietrich said firmly. "Absolutely not." Vane stepped forward, aggressively invading Dietrich's space. "I am not asking you. I am telling you. My men have bleeding gums. They need the fruit. Boil it." "Sergeant, you do not understand the chemistry," Dietrich said, keeping his voice carefully neutral, though his eyes were hard. "This pot is unlined copper. The tin coating has completely worn away. If we boil highly acidic fruit, green apples, unripe tomatoes, the acetic acid will react directly with the raw copper. It will strip the metal." Vane laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Chemistry. You think I care about your German textbook excuses. You just do not want to do the work. You do not want my men getting strong. It is not an excuse. It is poison," Dietrich stated, refusing to back down. "The only poison here is you, Kessler," Vane snarled. He turned to his own men, 2 young privates who were watching the exchange. "Clean that copper pot. Fill it with water from the stream. Dump the fruit in and boil it over the rear grate. If the German will not do it, we will do it ourselves." Dietrich stepped back. He had given the warning. As a prisoner, intervening further meant risking a bullet. He watched in grim silence as the British soldiers hacked the green fruit into pieces, dumped them into the tarnished copper pot, and set it over the roaring flames of the secondary firebox. For an hour, the acidic mixture boiled. The smell was sharp, tart, cutting through the heavy scent of the pork fat. When it was reduced to a thick, pulpy stew, Vane proudly ordered it distributed to his platoon alongside their meat rations. The real danger was not hidden in the tree line. It was brewing inside a tarnished metal pot. 30 minutes after the meal, the camp descended into pure chaos. It started with one man dropping his rifle, clutching his stomach, his face draining of all color. He fell to his knees, violently vomiting into the mud. Within seconds, another man collapsed, groaning in sheer agony, gripping his abdomen. Then a third. Then 5 more. Suddenly, 20 British soldiers were incapacitated, retching violently, sweating profusely, their bodies desperately trying to purge a severe gastrointestinal irritant. Panic ripped through the ruins. "Medic," someone screamed. "We are under attack." But there was no gunfire. There was only the sound of men violently ill. Sergeant Vane stared at his collapsing men, his mind racing. He looked at the empty copper pot. Then, his head snapped toward the kitchen. His eyes locked onto Dietrich Kessler. All the hatred, all the suspicion that Vane had harbored for days instantly crystallized into absolute certainty. Vane racked the bolt of his rifle, jacking a live round into the chamber. He raised the rifle, sprinting across the mud toward the Feldkotcherd. "You bastard," Vane screamed, his face purple with rage. He aimed the rifle directly at Dietrich's head. "You poisoned them. I knew it. I bloody knew it." Arndt and Gunter threw themselves into the mud, screaming in terror. Dietrich stood perfectly still. He did not raise his hands. He did not flinch. He looked down the barrel of the rifle with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too much stupidity in the world. Major Thorne sprinted into the clearing, drawing his revolver. Vane. Stand down. Lower the weapon. He poisoned the platoon, sir, Vane roared, his finger white on the trigger. Look at them. He spiked the main batch while we were not looking. He is killing us from the inside. Thorne looked at the violently ill men. The symptoms were sudden, severe, and terrifying. The logic was inescapable. They had trusted the enemy, and the enemy had struck. Thorne raised his revolver, aiming it at Dietrich's chest. The fragile trust they had built was instantly shattered. Did you do this, Kessler? Thorne asked, his voice dead and cold. Dietrich looked at the two weapons aimed at him. He knew that any sudden movement, any stuttered denial, would result in his immediate execution. He needed to prove the truth, and he needed to do it using the only language a starving, terrified army understood. Evidence. Major, Dietrich said calmly, allow me to approach the serving table. Stay exactly where you are, Vane barked. Let him move, Thorne ordered, though his revolver did not waver. Slowly. Dietrich stepped deliberately toward the wooden folding table where the remaining rations sat. There was a metal bowl filled with the main stew, the pork fat and root vegetables that Dietrich had cooked in the sealed iron kettle. Beside it was the empty copper pot that Vane's men had used for the green fruit. Dietrich picked up a heavy wooden spoon. He dipped it into the main stew. He lifted a large portion to his mouth and ate it. He swallowed deliberately, showing his empty mouth. He took another spoonful. And another. He ate rapidly, consuming a massive portion of the food Vane claimed was poisoned. He stood there, waiting. 10 seconds. 30 seconds. A full minute passed. Dietrich did not double over. He did not vomit. He stood perfectly straight. The main batch is completely safe, Dietrich said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He then pointed the wooden spoon directly at the dented copper laundry pot. The poison is there, Dietrich stated, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. He looked directly at Vane. I warned you, Sergeant. You called it a German excuse. I call it food science. Thorne stepped closer, his eyes darting between Dietrich and the sick men. Explain. Now. It is heavy metal toxicity, Dietrich said, stepping toward the copper pot and tapping it with his spoon. When you boil highly acidic organic matter, like unripe tomatoes and green apples, the acid acts as a corrosive solvent. This pot is unlined. The raw copper leached directly into the boiling fruit. You did not make a jam, Sergeant. You manufactured copper sulfate. A severe emetic and gastrointestinal irritant. Vane lowered his rifle an inch, his face pale, confusion warring with his rage. That is impossible. We boil water in copper all the time. Water is neutral, Dietrich snapped, his patience finally breaking, the master chef scolding a foolish apprentice. Acid is not. You fed your men a concentrated dose of liquid copper. They are not dying. The body is forcibly rejecting the heavy metal. They will be violently ill for 12 hours, they will suffer severe cramps, but they will survive. Provided they drink clean water. Thorne slowly lowered his revolver. He looked at the copper pot, seeing the bright, scoured lines on the inside where the acid had literally eaten the tarnish away, leaving the metal artificially shiny. He looked at his sick men. He looked at Vane, whose hands were suddenly shaking as the realization of his own arrogance hit him. Vane had poisoned his own men out of stubborn ignorance. And the German prisoner had tried to stop him. Thorne holstered his weapon. The silence in the camp was deafening, broken only by the groans of the sick soldiers. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The authority of rank and uniform had just been completely dismantled by the absolute authority of professional competence. Thorne turned to Vane. "Sergeant. Get the medics. Get those men hydrated. And if you ever touch a piece of cooking equipment again without Kessler's explicit permission, I will have you court-martialed for sabotage." Vane swallowed hard, his face flushed with profound humiliation. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, avoiding Dietrich's gaze entirely. "Yes, sir." Thorne turned back to Dietrich. The Major's eyes held a new, profound level of respect. It was no longer just the desperate reliance of a starving man. It was the deep, undeniable respect of a commanding officer recognizing a master of his craft. "Kessler," Thorne said quietly. "From this moment until we reach the Allied lines, this kitchen is your absolute domain. No British soldier overrides you regarding the preparation of food. Is that understood?" Dietrich nodded slowly. "Understood, Major." "Clean up this mess," Thorne ordered, turning away. Dietrich watched the British officer walk back to the command tent. He looked down at his trembling hands. The adrenaline was slowly fading, leaving him exhausted. He had survived the barrel of a gun not by fighting, but by knowing exactly how a green apple reacts to raw copper. He turned back to the massive iron Feldkotcherd. It stood in the sleet, a dark, immovable beast of sustenance. Dietrich picked up his canvas rag and began to carefully wipe down the iron casing. The war was raging all around them, empires were falling, and men were dying by the thousands. But here, in this tiny patch of frozen mud, Dietrich Kessler had drawn a line. He was the caterer. And in his kitchen, the laws of chemistry outranked the laws of war. The winter of 1944 did not arrive. It assaulted. As the 50th Northumbrian Division pushed toward the Dutch border, the autumn mud froze into iron ridges. The temperature plummeted to 10 degrees below zero. Frostbite became a more frequent casualty than German shrapnel. The men were surviving, largely due to the relentless mechanical heartbeat of the Feldkotcherd 11, but survival in sub-zero temperatures is a fragile, mathematical equilibrium. Boiled root vegetables and rendered fat provided baseline fuel, but the human machine requires more than basic caloric maintenance to function under fire. The British soldiers were eating standard-issue hardtack biscuits. These were dense squares of flour and water baked to the consistency of porcelain. Men with bleeding gums from early-stage vitamin C deficiency were literally breaking their molars trying to consume them. Morale was fracturing. The cold was a physical weight that pressed down on their chests, making every breath an exhausting labor. Dietrich Kessler understood the breaking point of men. He had seen it in the trenches of the First World War. A man can fight without ammunition for a time. He cannot fight without hope. And in the freezing hell of a winter siege, hope had a very specific, chemical composition. It was yeast, flour, water, and heat. Dietrich sought out Major Thorne. The British officer was shivering in a ruined farmhouse, wrapping his boots in scavenged burlap to prevent his toes from blackening. "I require bricks," Dietrich stated, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Refractory bricks. Clay and silica. And sheet metal." Thorne looked up, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. "For what, Kessler?" "The men are losing their teeth on the rations," Dietrich replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, entirely professional. "A man who cannot chew cannot eat. A man who cannot eat drops his rifle. The field kitchen is designed for boiling and roasting. It is a wet heat. I need a dry heat environment. I need to build an oven. I need to bake bread." Thorne stared at the German prisoner. It was an absurd logistical request. They were in the middle of an active war zone, under sporadic artillery fire, and the enemy cook was asking for construction materials to open a bakery. But Thorne also knew the medical metrics. A warm, fresh loaf of bread offered immediate, easily digestible complex carbohydrates. It offered a massive psychological advantage. Thorne did not argue. He dispatched a salvage detail. For 2 relentless days, Dietrich, Arndt, and the young apprentice Gunter worked in the freezing ruins of a bombed-out Dutch porcelain factory. They scavenged heavy, fire-resistant bricks from the shattered kilns. Dietrich operated with the precision of a master architect. He did not simply stack stones. He calculated thermal mass. He instructed the British soldiers on exactly how to mix a crude but effective mortar from clay, ash, and river sand. They constructed a dome. It was 3 feet wide, built directly over a secondary fire trench they dug into the frozen earth. Dietrich lined the floor of the dome with the smoothest bricks they could find. He then salvaged a massive, heavy sheet of steel from the hull of a destroyed transport truck to act as a primary seal. "It is about thermodynamics," Dietrich explained to Sergeant Vane. Vane was standing nearby, watching the construction with silent, lingering skepticism. Vane had not spoken a harsh word to Dietrich since the incident with the poison copper pot, but the old sniper was still watching him. Dietrich pointed to the brick dome. "We will build a massive wood fire directly inside the chamber. We let it burn for 3 hours until the bricks reach approximately 250 degrees Celsius. The clay absorbs the heat. Then, we sweep the ashes out completely. The chamber is empty, but the thermal energy remains trapped in the masonry. That radiant heat will bake the dough perfectly, from all sides, without the smoke ruining the crust." Vane looked at the crude structure, then at Dietrich's scarred hands. "Let us hope your masonry is as good as your chemistry, Kessler." The next morning, 3 hours before dawn, Dietrich began the process. He had hoarded the British flour rations. He had protected the living yeast cultures inside his own grey tunic, keeping them alive with his own body heat against the freezing night. He mixed the dough in a massive wooden trough, his arms plunging into the heavy mixture, folding, pressing, stretching the gluten networks. He worked in a rhythmic, hypnotic trance. This was his sanctuary. The war did not exist here. Only the dough existed. When the interior bricks glowed a dull, angry orange in the pre-dawn darkness, Gunter swept the coals out. Dietrich used a crude wooden peel to slide 30 heavy loaves onto the searing hot floor of the oven. He slammed the steel sheet over the opening. 45 minutes later, he pulled the steel sheet away. The smell hit the frozen camp like a physical shockwave. It rolled through the frost-covered canvas tents and the icy foxholes. It was the rich, intoxicating, deeply human scent of caramelized sugars, roasted yeast, and toasted grain. It was a smell that had been entirely absent from this shattered continent for years. Soldiers who had been huddled in frozen misery slowly stood up, turning their filthy faces toward the ruins of the factory like dying plants turning toward the sun. Dietrich pulled the loaves out. They were magnificent. Dark, crusty, perfectly risen. When he cracked the first loaf open, the steam plumed into the air, revealing a soft, dense, blindingly white interior. He handed the first piece to Major Thorne. The officer took it, the heat burning his freezing, numb fingers. He took a bite. The crust shattered perfectly. The soft interior melted on his tongue. Thorne closed his eyes, his shoulders dropping as the pure, unadulterated comfort of the food bypassed his military discipline and touched his very soul. "Pass it out," Thorne ordered, his voice thick. "Every man gets a share." Simultaneously, Gunter was managing the secondary miracle. The men called it victory tea. The British soldiers were desperate for their national beverage, but standard field preparation resulted in a lukewarm, bitter brew. Gunter utilized the Feldkochert's pressure valves to boil the water instantly. He brewed the dark, tannin-heavy leaves, but he added a specifically calculated ratio of condensed milk and crushed, boiled fruit candies they had salvaged from an abandoned railway depot. The result was a boiling hot, intensely sweet, highly caffeinated liquid that sent a surge of pure glucose directly into the bloodstream. Together, the hot bread and the victory tea fundamentally transformed the 50th Division. They were no longer a freezing, desperate mob. They were soldiers fueled by the absolute highest standard of professional care. The gastrointestinal illness rates plummeted. Caloric retention increased by 22%. The men marched harder, dug trenches faster, and held their lines with a renewed, grim determination. But military bureaucracy is a blind machine. It does not recognize the value of a warm loaf of bread. It only recognizes paper. In late January 1945, the front line temporarily stabilized near Cleves. A convoy of rear-echelon supply trucks arrived, accompanied by an inspection team from Sector Command. Leading the team was Captain Harris of the military police. Harris was a man whose uniform was perfectly pressed, utterly devoid of mud, and whose mind operated strictly within the narrow confines of the manual. Harris walked through the camp, his clipboard in hand, noting petty infractions. When he reached the clearing where the massive Feldkirchert sat, his pen stopped. He stared at Dietrich, Arndt, and Gunter. The three men were wearing their grey Wehrmacht trousers under white aprons, their sleeves heavily stamped with the letters POW. Major Thorn, Harris barked, his voice ringing with aristocratic authority. What in the name of God are three enemy combatants doing operating freely within your command perimeter? Thorn stepped forward, his posture rigid. They are the catering staff, Captain. They are prisoners of war, Harris snapped, his face reddening. Geneva Convention protocols and British Army regulations mandate that all captured personnel be transferred immediately to Class 3 internment facilities in the rear. You have unsecured enemy personnel handling division food supplies. This is a massive security breach. I am ordering their immediate arrest and transfer to the processing camp at Ostend. Dietrich froze, a heavy sack of flour in his hands. A transfer to a general POW camp meant starvation rations, typhus, and the loss of his kitchen. It meant returning to the status of a caged animal. Gunter looked terrified. Thorn did not flinch. He did not draw a weapon. He drew a logistical ledger. With respect, Captain, Thorn said, his voice deadly calm. You will do no such thing. Harris stepped closer, his hand resting on his service belt. Are you refusing a direct order, Major? I am adhering to War Office Directive 7342, Paragraph 4, issued December 1944, Thorn recited flawlessly, tapping the ledger. It stipulates that German prisoners of war with specialized technical or culinary training may be retained at the unit level if their skills directly contribute to the operational efficiency and logistical superiority of the frontline forces. Harris scoffed. Operational efficiency. They are cooks. Thorn opened the ledger and shoved it hard into Harris's chest. Look at the numbers, Captain. Read them. Since Kessler took command of that kitchen, dysentery in this division has dropped by 90%. Fuel consumption for boiling water is down 30%. He extracts 400 more calories out of standard rations than our own manual dictates. My men are fighting in sub-zero temperatures, and they are not dying of exposure because that man knows how to process complex carbohydrates better than anyone in the British Army. Thorn stepped directly into Harris's personal space. He is not a security risk. He is a strategic asset. And if you try to take him, you will have to explain to a tribunal why you crippled the combat effectiveness of a frontline infantry division over a paperwork technicality. Harris looked at the ledgers. He looked at the massive iron stove. Then, he looked past Thorn. Standing 10 feet away was Sergeant Vane. The old veteran had his rifle slung casually over his shoulder, but his hand was resting firmly on the stock. Behind Vane, a dozen heavily armed, combat-hardened British infantrymen had silently gathered. They were staring at Captain Harris with eyes that had seen the worst horrors of the winter. They were not pointing their weapons, but the implication was absolute. No rear echelon officer was going to take away the man who baked their bread. Harris swallowed hard. The pressed perfection of his uniform suddenly felt very fragile amidst the hardened, filthy reality of the frontline soldiers. He shoved the ledger back at Thorn. Ensure their paperwork is filed in triplicate, Major, Harris muttered, turning on his heel. He walked swiftly back to his jeep, eager to escape the suffocating hostility of the clearing. Thorn watched the jeep drive away. He turned to look at Dietrich. The German baker slowly lowered the sack of flour. He looked at Thorn, and then he looked at Sergeant Vane. Vane gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away. Dietrich realized then that he was no longer a captive. He had been adopted. He was protected by the very men who had conquered him, bound by a mutual, unbreakable contract of survival. Months bled into the spring. The snow melted, turning the landscape back into a sea of mud, and the Allied war machine ground relentlessly into the heart of Germany. Dietrich cooked through the ruins of his own country. It was a surreal, agonizing experience. He was feeding the army that was systematically dismantling his homeland. But he kept his focus on the iron kettle, on the pressure gauges, on the absolute necessity of the work. On May 8, 1945, the radio crackles in the command tent translated into a roar that echoed across the continent. Unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The British camp erupted in a frenzy of exhausted, weeping, screaming celebration. Men fired rifles into the air, they embraced, they collapsed into the mud in sheer relief. Inside the Feldkirche, there was only a profound, heavy silence. Dietrich, Arndt, and Gunther stood shoulder to shoulder. The Reich was dead. Their cities were ashes. Their families were scattered or buried under rubble. The grey uniforms they wore beneath their aprons were now the garments of a vanquished, broken empire. The psychological weight of the defeat was crushing. Dietrich felt a phantom pain in his chest, a deep sorrow for the city of Frankfurt, for his old bakery, for a life that no longer existed. Gunther began to cry quietly. Arndt stared blankly at the iron stove. Dietrich took a slow, deep breath. He reached up and straightened his white apron. He smoothed the creases. He turned to the wooden prep table. "Wash your hands," Dietrich commanded, his voice steady, breaking the silence. Arndt looked at him, bewildered. "Chef. The war is over." "The shooting is over," Dietrich corrected him. "But men still need to eat. And tonight, they will want a victory dinner. We are professionals. We will do our duty until we are relieved." He walked over to the supply crates. The British quartermaster had delivered a hoard of preserved food for the occasion. Tins of American Spam, heavy cans of dried pineapple rings, sacks of powdered eggs, and refined white flour. Dietrich approached the meal with the solemnity of a state banquet. It was an incredibly bitter moment. He was preparing a feast to celebrate the destruction of his own nation. But he refused to let the defeat strip him of his dignity. His dignity lived in his hands, in his knife work, in his mastery of fire. He trimmed the blocks of Spam, rendering the fat to create a searing hot pan. He reconstituted the dried pineapple juice with sugar, creating a thick, dark glaze. He baked a massive batch of Duchess potatoes, piping the mashed roots perfectly. He moved with a furious, defiant precision. If this was to be his final act as a prisoner, it would be absolutely flawless. When the meal was served, Major Thorn ordered the men to form a line. He stood at the front. There was no gloating. There was no jeering at the defeated Germans. The British soldiers had lived with these men through the worst winter of their lives. They knew the cost of the food they were about to eat. Thorn stepped up to the serving table. Dietrich plated the glazed meat and potatoes, handing the tin to the major. Their eyes met. There was a vast ocean of unsaid words between them. The victor and the vanquished. The captor and the caterer. "Thank you, Kessler," Thorn said quietly. "For everything." "It was my kitchen, Major," Dietrich replied simply. "I only tended the fire." The transition to peace was chaotic, but Thorn kept his word. By utilizing bureaucratic loopholes regarding essential transitional personnel, Dietrich and his team were spared the brutal, overcrowded POW camps. They cooked for the occupation forces until late autumn, saving their military wages. When they were finally demobilized, they were issued civilian papers and letters of highest recommendation stamped by the British military command. 17 years later. October 1962. The city of Frankfurt had risen from its own ashes. The economic miracle of West Germany had transformed the bombed-out craters into bustling avenues of glass and steel. On a quiet, rain-slicked street corner stood a restaurant. The sign above the door read, "The Northumbrian." Inside, the restaurant was a sanctuary of warm mahogany, polished brass, and the rich, complex aroma of roasted meats and simmering stocks. It was impeccably clean. Behind the dark wood counter stood Dietrich Kessler. He was 60 years old. His hair was completely white, and the lines on his face were carved deep by history. He wore a pristine white chef's jacket. He was a wealthy man now, a respected pillar of the Frankfurt culinary scene. He had taken the logistics of mass feeding he learned in the mud of Normandy and applied them to commercial hospitality. Arndt had returned to Hamburg to rebuild a luxury hotel, and young Gunther was now an executive chef in Munich, both carrying the meticulous discipline they had learned around an iron-field stove. The brass bell above the front door chimed. Dietrich looked up. A man stepped out of the cold autumn rain. He was older, wearing a heavy tweed overcoat. He walked with a slight, noticeable limp. His hair was gray, but his eyes were the exact same color of cracked winter ice. It was Silas Vane. Dietrich stopped wiping the counter. He laid the towel down perfectly square. He stared at the man who had once held a loaded rifle to his chest. Vane slowly took off his wet hat. He looked around the immaculate restaurant, taking in the white tablecloths, the gleaming silverware, the framed photograph of a massive iron Feldkircher 11 hanging discreetly near the kitchen doors. Vane walked slowly toward the counter. He did not look like a conqueror. He looked like an old man carrying a heavy memory. He reached into the deep pocket of his tweed coat. Dietrich tensed slightly, an old reflex from a dangerous time. Vane pulled his hand out and placed an object gently on the polished mahogany. It was small, heavy, and tarnished black with age. Dietrich looked down. It was a solid silver medallion. His master baker's guild token. He had worn it under his uniform for luck. He had lost it in the mud of Normandy on the very day he was captured. He had assumed it was buried forever under the tracks of the tanks. "You dropped this by the wheels of that massive iron beast," Vane said, his voice raspy, carrying the weight of decades. "I picked it up. I kept it in my pocket. At first, I kept it because I hated you. I wanted a trophy from the enemy." Vane looked up, meeting Dietrich's eyes. But as the winter went on, Vane continued, his voice softening. "Every time I ate your bread, every time I drank that tea, I touched this piece of silver in my pocket. And I realized I was not carrying a trophy from an enemy. I was holding the property of the man who was keeping my boys alive. I have held on to it for 18 years. It belongs to you." Dietrich stared at the medallion. The tarnished silver seemed to hold the cold of that terrible winter, but also the strange, desperate grace of what they had accomplished together. He reached out and picked it up. His scarred thumb rubbed over the engraved wheat sheaf. He looked at Vane. The hostility that had defined their first meeting was gone, washed away by time and the absolute truth of survival. They were just two old men who had survived the madness of the 20th century. "Thank you, Silas," Dietrich said quietly, using the man's first name for the very first time. Vane nodded once, a stiff, formal gesture. He turned to leave, pulling his coat tighter. "Wait," Dietrich called out. Vane stopped, his hand on the brass handle of the door. Dietrich gestured to a small, quiet table near the back of the restaurant, near the warmth of the kitchen doors. "The weather is terrible," Dietrich said, his voice dropping into the familiar, authoritative cadence of the master chef. "You have traveled a long way. The kitchen is preparing a heavy beef stew. The potatoes are perfect. You will sit. You will eat." Vane looked at the table. He looked at the rain lashing against the window. Then he looked back at the German baker. A small, genuine smile cracked the hardened lines of Vane's face. I suppose I do not have a choice, Vane said quietly. I know better than to argue with the caterer. Vane walked to the table and sat down. Dietrich walked into his kitchen. The war had ended on pieces of paper signed by politicians in grand rooms. But for Dietrich Kessler and Silas Vane, the peace was finally sealed, 18 years later, over a hot bowl of soup.